recently put out a video in which I gave a general overview of some of the hardware used in modern cash registers, and I thought nobody would care about that, but I was wrong. Apparently you all want to know as much as possible about that topic, and I'm not one to argue. So, as of today, CRD now stands for Cash Register Dude. Update your contact lists accordingly. But seriously, folks, I really was astonished at the response to that video. I thought it would do okay, but not gangbusters, and instead it was my most successful release of 2025 by a wide margin, which of course means I'm now incredibly self-conscious about what to do next. But that's just normal, so let's press on. That last episode was titled Basic Retail Hardware, and it was an overview of the kind of machines that are used to accept money at stores these days. I focused on the accessories that plugged into them and the funky serial and USB ports they use, and everyone seemed to like that, but it kind of surprised me that no one pointed out how odd it was to start out by talking about barcode scanners instead of, how one of these things is actually used. At no point in that video did I actually ring something up, except in a dorky skit where you really couldn't tell what I was doing. And I didn't even really show you the machines themselves either, just the plugs on the back. And that's because those were the only parts of the whole situation that I felt I could adequately explain in less runtime than James Cameron's hit film Titanic. So when I threatened in that video to make a 4-hour follow-up episode describing how to operate a single cash register, I think a lot of viewers assumed I was exaggerating. I wasn't, but you all called my bluff, so I started writing the script anyway. But then I ran into problems. See, the system I was going to address was called Wayne Nucleus, and it's a product developed specifically for use by gas station convenience stores. And that's an extremely niche use case, so as you'd expect, it has 1,000 options specific to that niche, like underground gas tank monitoring and car wash management. And that stuff's neat, but after a few days of writing, it started to feel a bit overwhelming as an introduction to retail systems, so I thought I should try something a bit more general purpose. So I then spent a week trying to set up another very well-known system called Toshiba SurePOS, which is used by thousands of businesses of all different types, only to discover that my TCX 350 was really a 350E, which doesn't support SurePOS. And obviously my instinct was to rush to eBay and buy the right machine, except that by this point, your head is swimming, right? This is a lot to take in, and that's coming from me. It's even worse when you don't actually know what these systems are meant to do. And probably an awful lot of people watching this have never worked retail, so you won't know the fundamentals. And that's when I realized my real mistake, which was trying to start with any of the modern systems at all. See, it's really hard to explain the fundamentals using one of those because they're buried under so much unrelated crap. Let me explain. When you go to a store, you probably think of the thing that the cashier punches numbers into before taking your money as the cash register. And that's true, but most of the machines you've encountered in your life were probably a type called a point of sale or POS system. Yes, it's true in both senses of the term. And while those do function as cash registers, they also do a lot of other things. Cash registering is just one of many functions. And to be clear, I'm not really verbing that noun as a bit. The original purpose of these things when they were invented 150 years ago was literally to register cash. And the basic principles of that task haven't ever really changed. Modern day POS systems do the same things as registers from a century ago, they just do so much else in addition that we don't really recognize that original purpose anymore. But I think it would be very useful to recognize that purpose because it informs a lot of the decision making in modern systems. The trouble is you can't really reduce those systems back to the fundamentals because they're simply too ambitious. There are thousands of different software packages used for handling sales these days, and virtually all of them require extensive configuration before they'll do anything, using Byzantine interfaces that not only demand lengthy training to comprehend, but also assume that you know the basics of retail cash management. If you don't, then none of it will make any sense. So I felt that we'd all benefit from looking at a machine that's essentially 50 years behind the times and thus predates all these developments. And that's how I ended up, once again, going back on my word. This is a true cash register. And I mentioned these as a type of device that exists in the last video, but I followed that up with something like, you probably could do a video about these things, but I'm not the guy to do it because I find them really boring. And at this point, I don't even know why I say stuff like that because I'm just cursing myself to do it anyway. So it's a Royal 9150. I picked it up on eBay a couple weeks ago for $20 plus shipping, and it's a very conventional specimen. I'd almost call it classic. It's from the mid to late 90s, I think, but its feature set is so sparse that it barely outperforms machines from the 60s. That makes it a great place to start you from, though, and conveniently, it's also roughly where I started from. I got my first job at age 17, ringing up customers at a proto e-waste store on a machine much like this one. And while it wasn't this one, the rudiments are so simple that when this arrived, I was able to use it without even reading the manual. Seriously, it's incredibly straightforward. Let me show you. Say you come into my store and you want to buy a Gatorade for $1.95, right? So I punch in $1.95, I hit beverages, you hand me $5, so I put that in. Your change is $2.86. All right, out of 5, 1, 2, 75 cents, 85 cents, 86 cents. Here's your receipt. Have a nice day. Simple as. That, by the way, is exactly what job training looks like at the kind of place that would have bought one of these. Quick and sloppy, probably much like the store itself. That's who these were for, after all. Places that just needed a register, no further adjectives. And while those places still exist, the market for these plain old registers seems to be all but dead. Even if you don't care about this stuff at all, it's hard to have missed the shift in small business towards tablet-based sales solutions from companies like Clover and Square. They're cheap and easy to set up, they have integrated payment processing, and they offer so much room for growth that it's really no surprise they've come to dominate even the low end of the market. To wit, if you've been to a chain or non-chain coffee shop in the last 10 years, chances are you paid for your drink on an iPad. And these solutions work great, but I often wonder how many really tiny businesses truly benefit from all their advanced features versus their downsides. Even the simplest mobile app has irritating complexities and failure modes. Sure, Square can run offline, but nothing stops your login token from expiring at the same moment that your email account gets hijacked and your crappy cellular internet goes down, so you lose the ability to run transactions for 18 hours while 3 different support tickets percolate through their respective apathetic queues. And no, person about to leave a comment, I didn't work at the same place as you, I've just been around the block. The fact is that much of what Square and Clover offer, even in their simplest forms, involves employee logins, sales analytics, and inventory tracking. And sure, as the thinly veiled Starbucks stand-in put it in The Sopranos, that company puts every last f***ing coffee bean in the computer, but a lot of mom and pop stores don't have a need for anything like that.
It's over for the little guy.
If you're just a person who has some stuff and wants to trade it for money, then this kind of machine presents the lowest possible friction. You can just turn it on and use it, no questions asked. Now, of course, none of those things were actually true at my first job. We did have employees and inventory, so when we switched to a POS system about a year in, it was a tremendous relief that made things much easier. Indeed, POS systems really are very useful in the modern world because they keep track of sales trends and inventory and employees, but the fact remains that we got by for quite a while on a device like this because all those things are optional, while this delivers what is mandatory. Punch in a price, pick a department, here's your change, have a nice day. That's the job, and it always will be. So it's no surprise that I still have the muscle memory from running that machine, but I also have a memory of the first time that I looked at a feature on a device and thought, okay, I see the what here, but not the why, and went off in search of an explanation. That feature was this little plastic window here. This is where my fascination with this whole topic began 20 years ago, so it's where we'll start too. I guess I should probably show you what it does then. Well, I'm sure everyone enjoyed the screech of the receipt printer as I rang up that sale a minute ago. And if so, you're in luck because I'm going to ask you to listen closely while I do it several more times. Okay, I swear this was more obvious when I tested it at home, but take my word for it. Sometimes when it prints the receipt, partway through printing a line, you can hear a gap that doesn't show up on the receipt. So where's that gap? Well, if we take this cover off, now it should all make sense. Sort of. As you probably guessed from the sound, this is a dot matrix printer, and it looks pretty typical other than being on the small side. We have an ink ribbon here, and then this is the impact head, which moves back and forth. every time it prints something. But look at what it's printing on. There are 2 separate rolls of paper in here. So yeah, to acknowledge the buried lead, this is literally 2 printers, and they figured out how to build that using just 1.5 mechanisms. It's really very clever. The 2 paper rolls are driven separately from each other, so I can actually advance just one at a time. And while by default it does print the same thing on both strips, I can actually turn that off if I finish this transaction, then switch modes over here. Now, it'll only print on the right receipt. Now, the reason I can turn off that side, of course, is because that's the one that prints the customer receipt, and most people don't want a receipt for a $1.50 Gatorade, so why waste the paper, right? But the second one, I can't turn off. It always prints no matter what, and it doesn't come out the top of the machine. Instead, it's rolled up onto this take-up reel, and then once we put the cover back on, it actually locks in place with a key, so I can now see this printout, but I can't touch it. I mean, well, on this specific model I can, because the window here actually flips open, so I can touch it, but that's a very odd feature that I've not seen on any other model. I'll speculate on why that's here much later, but the point is, even if you do open it, the receipt can't be removed, and you can't modify it without destroying it. So all you can really do is see that it's there, and this is very much on purpose. The function of this window is to remind you that that receipt is there and that you can't touch it. And while I could explain why in a few words, I'd much rather explain the ancient history and fundamental purpose of the cash register and how this little plastic window is literally a solution developed in the 1870s that's still relevant today. So, get your books out, class. This one's going to be Retail 102, History and Theory. To get a few things straight up front, let's just start from the middle. The development of the cash register is a long and complex story, which I won't be covering in great detail today, but a very important point to make is that these things were invented in the 1800s, they underwent a slow and plodding development process for a few decades, and then they experienced a massive technological leap in the back half of the 20th century. So the very basic machine that I have here is incredibly sophisticated by the standards of even the early 70s, and the reason for that is all in the name. This is classified as an ECR, or electronic cash register, so obviously what it replaced wasn't one of those things. 3 guesses as to which. To be clear, there certainly were electronic registers in use as early as the mid-70s, at least in the wealthier stores. Places like Sears were fully computerized by 1975, and the systems they used, which were based on enormous mainframes with terminals at each check stand, did all kinds of analytics and reporting, much like the modern ones do. There were also small standalone devices, much like mine, albeit far more primitive, and the wealthier, medium-sized stores had those, but if you went into, say, a diner, chances are the register looked more like, well, okay, please hold while I go get it. Go. We're keeping that. There we go. Oh, jeez. So this is a typical early 70s offering from NCR, the biggest name in the market at the time. It's called a Class 24. It weighs 75 pounds, and it doesn't contain any electronics. In fact, it barely contains electrics. There we go. Can I rotate this? I'm gonna rip the feet off. There we go. There we go. That's what you wanted to see. Oh boy. So it's electromechanical. All the calculations are done by contraptions made of cams and levers, which technically speaking still counts as a computer, but not the way we use the word nowadays. Though I admit, it does support Rust. Yow! This is a nearly solid hunk of steel plates and springs whose only concession to modernity? Its only concession to maternity is that it's all driven by a motor, at least whenever possible. Normally, when you hit this button, the motor runs the mechanism and makes this terrible clattering noise and makes everything turn. But if the power goes out, then you can flip up this little door on the side and a crank plugs in right there. You can run it by hand. So this is basically a Babbage difference engine, yet it was built at least as late as 1972, per a YouTube comment I found, and also all the pennies that fell out when I took the bottom off. There we go. Got my hand on the subframe. Oh shit. Well, while it may seem hard to believe that this literally Victorian technology was still in use that long, it actually dominated the market. Per this 1973 Computer World article, only $16 million of revenue that year came from electronic registers, while $208 million, or 13 times more, was from mechanicals. Intriguingly, there was also $20 million in revenue from point-of-sale machines, so they were outselling plain old electronic registers, but we have to remember that at this point in time, those were enormous systems based around mainframes, which typically included no fewer than 10 checkout stations per store, and they probably cost over $1 million a piece. So that number may literally represent hardware that was deployed to just 10 or 20 locations. On the other hand, we can probably safely assume that a standalone register like this cost at most $2,000 in 70s bucks. And that would mean they sold at least 100,000 registers like this, which is a mind-boggling number. It makes you wonder where they all wound up. You'd think we'd be knee-deep in these goddamn boat anchors. Now, of course, they had projections that the market would shift very rapidly to electronic machines over the next couple years, and maybe it did, but that only would have applied to new sales, and the turnover in this market was not enormous. While these machines were limited and primitive by modern standards, they did serve the purpose. They were also fairly reliable and repairable, believe it or not, and they definitely weren't cheap. So a lot of businesses that bought these well up into the late 70s would have hung on to them as long as they kept working. Indeed, they show up in the backgrounds of plenty of movies from the mid-80s and even later, and some of the pennies I found in this thing were minted as late as 1982. So while fully electronic machines were definitely a common sight by the mid-80s, I feel comfortable guessing that they weren't truly universal until probably the early 90s. And now I can get rid of this thing. And the reason it took so long to replace those things is that they did do the bare minimum, which is pretty much what I showed you a few minutes ago. They let you enter prices, produce a total, in some cases calculate change, and produce a receipt, which is all that most retailers needed. Hell, even that could be overkill. Again, in a lot of places, transactions are so trivial that receipts are rarely needed, and most cashiers could calculate change in their heads until fairly recently, so that just leaves the adding function, which could be achieved on a simple calculator, which is in fact what many businesses used to have. Take a look at the scene in RoboCop, for instance. This literal mom and pop convenience store has a cash drawer behind the counter, but when we see the reverse angle, there's no register there, just an electromechanical adding machine from Remington Rand. Okay, I might have made a mistake here, but I'm not certain. While editing, I noticed that in the corner of this shot, you actually can see a cash register. It's over on the extreme right end, but it doesn't show up from any other angle, and the cash drawer we saw does appear to be beneath the adding machine, so I'm not sure what the intent was here. Like, maybe they had the register and then it broke and they couldn't afford to fix it, so they switched to the Remington? Or maybe they upgrade from the Remington to a real register, but kept it around in case they had heavy traffic and both of them need to ring people up at once. Or maybe this is an intermediate place to keep spare cash, so they don't have to open the safe in the middle of a business day, which, now that you think about it, would be pretty tough given the camouflage they set up. Or maybe this is just a movie set and doesn't make sense. In any case, it doesn't really affect my narrative, as you'll see in a moment. I just didn't want you to wonder what I was on about. Anyway, there absolutely were stores that worked this way, and I know this because I visited some as late as the 2000s, where my purchases were rung up on a plain old adding machine. They just punched in what I bought, multiplied by the local tax rate, and did the change in their head. Instead of a drawer, they kept their cash in basically a tackle box under the counter, and if they wanted to run a credit card, they had a separate merchant terminal and manually punched in the total. If you know, you know. All of this was totally workable, and still is, but only at tiny businesses. You know, places where the cashier is also the owner, where their inventory system is that they buy stuff when they run out, and where they have no employees to speak of. In that kind of business, the only thing you care about is how much was earned on a given day. And if that was how most stores worked, then maybe the cash register as we know it wouldn't exist. But in reality, most stores have at least one hired employee, and that changes everything. If I turn my machine off, then back on and try to ring you up again, it's mad at me. I pressed the exact same keystrokes, but it's not happy because it wants a clerk number. That's its term for a username to prove that I'm an authorized cashier, and if so, which one? And like any user account, this serves two purposes. It allows restrictions to be placed on my actions, and it allows those actions to be logged against my name. Indeed, if I run a transaction, you can see my name is printed right at the top of the receipt. In fact, both receipts. And this goes to the heart of the matter. While registers have evolved to do many different things over the years, the reason they were invented and became ubiquitous comes back to the simple problem that you just can't find good help. By most accounts, the first cash register was sold in 1879 by a guy named James Ritty, who gave it the incredible name Ritty's Incorruptible Cashier. Now, besides just being one hell of a title, that name also gives us a great summary of why the industry was founded, which is why it's such a shame that this story isn't actually true. In fact, everything I just said is wrong, as is virtually every source of info on this topic. I already had to fix 2 different wiki pages, but there's thousands of websites and books going back decades that conflate the early history of this industry, so let's get a few things straight. First off, as badass as it sounds, this machine was not called the Incorruptible Cashier. There was a device by that name, and it was made by James Ritty, and it was very significant, but it came at least 2 models and half a year after this one. Also, people often refer to this early machine as the Ritty dial, but nobody called it that at the time because it was never actually sold. We don't even truly know what the machine looked like because no specimens survived, and while photos like this one frequently accompany pithy puff pieces on the subject, they all depict replicas built decades later, which not only lack functioning mechanisms, but don't even match Ritty's patent drawings. Speaking of which, you might think that maybe the dial machine was at least the first register to be patented, but that's not true either. Not by a long shot, actually. It was beat to the punch 3 years earlier by a device very cleverly named the cash recording machine. And it seems likely that there were more inventions in the meantime which didn't get patented because Ritty's own filing was titled Improvements on Cash Register, and also outright states that these were well-known devices. So it's clear as mud that our records of these early days are murky, but some parts seem truthy enough. As the legend goes, James Ritty was the proprietor of a saloon that sold booze, wine, and cigars, all very popular items, but he wasn't making a lot of money, and he suspected this was due to embezzlement. And that was probably true, because the retail sector has been plagued since the beginning of time by an unavoidable contradiction. Stores need a lot of workers, but they all have to be paid like crap. Retail, after all, is kind of a terrible industry. Stores mostly just get things from manufacturers, then hang on to them until you want one, hence the term store. And that means they add very little value to their products. That, in turn, means their margins are very slim because a huge chunk of the price tag for any given item typically goes straight to the manufacturer, leaving the store very little to keep for themselves. That means the only way to make a reasonable profit is by making lots of sales. But since each one requires a lot of time and effort, especially back in the 19th century when customers needed a lot more hand-holding, stores require a lot of employees to handle their sales, and those employees are rarely paid very well, partly because of the already slim margins, but also due to the low perceived skill requirements. To most storekeepers, a cashier is a beating heart and a pair of hands. This produces an economic pitfall so widely recognized that it actually has a name, the principal agent problem. In short, these jobs pay very poorly and have very little upwards mobility, yet the workers are expected to be trustworthy agents of the store and to uphold its interests by keeping track of sales, charging the right prices, not stealing product or allowing it to be stolen, and of course, handling vastly larger sums of money than they can ever expect to own. Obviously, this math looks pretty dumb up close, so a lot of folks then and now see the logic in skimming from the till. I won't get too deep into my opinions on that, but in short, while I think you shouldn't steal from work for a variety of largely practical reasons, I'm not too broken up about it because I feel that the people running the businesses also create the conditions that encourage theft, and that most people who steal probably don't feel like they have very many other options. Now, we could debate that, but I don't want to, so don't bother. But I do want to say two things. First, the fact of the matter is, this is a huge problem for the retail industry. Employee theft is the #1 cause of shrinkage per just about every report that exists, so we're going to spend the rest of this video acting as though all cashiers are thieves. This is unavoidable. It's the reason these machines exist, so we have to look at it from that perspective, and it gets exhausting to constantly hedge, but it probably feels pretty frustrating if you're a cashier who isn't a thief, because regardless of whether you think it's immoral to steal from Target, it sucks to be treated like a criminal simply because you aren't in a high-paying job at the moment. So for whatever it's worth, these aren't my feelings, and I don't think that people in entry-level jobs are dishonest by default. Nonetheless, by all reports, embezzlement really was widespread by the 19th century, and probably for a couple different reasons. One was that the prospects for improving your lifestyle were much worse than they are even now, but the other is that business accounting was essentially non-existent. According to books on the subject, particularly Richard Crandall's indispensable 1988 treatise, The Incorruptible Cashier, stores in the 1800s just didn't know how much money they had or what sales they'd made. Cash was kept in a simple box, sometimes called a till, but often just called the cash box, and all cashiers had free access to it. There was no way to control or record the money going in or out of it, and there wasn't even a way to know that a sale had been made unless the cashier chose to write it down in the ledger and happened to get the details right. The only piece of hard data a store owner really had was how much money was in the box at close of business, and they could subtract the previous day's total from that to see how much they were up for the day, but they couldn't tell how they'd arrived at that figure. If they took in $30 but someone swiped 10, then it just looked like they were up 20, and who was to say otherwise? This meant that as a cashier, nothing really stopped you from pinching big wads of cash, assuming you didn't get too greedy. Obviously, if the box was down at close of business, the boss would know what had happened. But if you simply pocketed everything that customers handed you, you were probably in the clear because the boss would never know what was supposed to have been in the till. Now, of course, if he was paying some attention, like counting how many customers walked out carrying purchases, he could guess roughly how much he should have taken in, and you might get noticed that way. But if you were smart, then when you sold a customer an item for $1, you'd just tell him it was $1.10. Then you put the right amount in the box while pocketing the spare dime, which counted for a lot more back then. And the only way you get noticed is if the customer happened to come back later, buy the same item, pay only $1, and mention that you'd overcharged them the other day. That might happen, but it probably wouldn't. So there were lots of ways to conceal theft. And on top of that, since the cash box was shared between clerks, even if the boss knew someone was stealing, he'd have a hell of a time proving who it was. It goes without saying then that this was a huge and widespread problem, and the only real way to solve it was to constantly watch over your cashier's shoulders. But at that point, why not just do the work yourself? The whole point of employees, after all, is to free up the boss to do other stuff, like fill out paperwork or drink. But if you aren't going to pay people enough to make them trustworthy, then constant vigilance is pretty much a necessity. Ritty, however, recognizing that he couldn't be in multiple places at once, had the idea to build a mechanical boss, a machine that could watch over his employees for him. Now, as we established, he wasn't the first person to think of this, but simultaneous inventions were very common back in those days, and as always, we just credit the person whose product succeeded. Though really, it's more accurate to say that the winners write the history books. While the dial machine never sold, Ritty's later products did, including the one that was actually called the Incorruptible Cashier. That machine appeared around late 1879, and it looked a lot more like what you'd expect. In fact, its design set the standard for almost every register sold over the next 40 years or so. So you'd think this guy's name would be pretty well known, but after a few years, he got sick of trying to make the business take off and sold the operation to another guy named John Henry Patterson, who renamed it to National Cash Register Company. They went on to sell countless millions of the things and are actually still a major player in the market as we speak. So When the day first came that someone asked who thought these things up in the first place, it was in NCR's interest to position the product they'd bought as the progenitor of the whole industry, especially because doing otherwise would have made their patent trolling much tougher. I may expand on this more in a future video about vintage registers, but in short, NCR functioned pretty much like the mob. They were regarded throughout the early 20th century as one of the most powerful and terrifying entities in the whole United States. Through the combination of a massive marketing campaign, the most ruthless sales tactics in the history of capitalism, and anti-competitive practices so intense they resulted in Patterson spending a year in jail, NCR single-handedly caused the cash register to become ubiquitous, and in doing so, redefined the face of business, as anyone who's held a job after the 19th century can attest. The modern employee, after all, lives in a veritable panopticon where their every move is tracked. From simple time clocks to video surveillance to data exfiltration detectors, you spend every minute being reminded that the company holds you at arm's length. But it all seems to have started right here with this machine. And although it's very different from anything we're used to, it still performs the one task universal to all cash registers. It keeps the cashier honest. Or more accurately, it helps you do that. Let's take a look at how the dial was probably used, and I'll explain what that means. Now, I say probably because there are no functioning specimens of the dial machine still in existence, and I haven't been able to find any trustworthy explanation of how it worked, just breathless puff pieces that can't be taken at face value. So I resorted to reading the patent, and after about a dozen tries, I still didn't get it, so I roped in some friends to help, and I think we worked it out. But take all this with a grain of salt. Per the patent drawings, the original machine had a series of keys labeled in 5-cent increments from 5 to 95 cents, then a dial with markings for the same values. And right away you might notice a problem because this doesn't look like the machine we've seen in the photos at all. The replicas have more keys plus a whole second hand on the dial, and this is apparently because they're based on a second version that Riddy developed, but if he patented it, I can't find the patent. So we're just going to hope that both machines worked about the same way, and it seems to be like this. When you press one of the keys, the dial hands swing around to indicate the amount. So if you press 65 cents, the long hand swings to 65. And if you then press $2, the short hand swings around to 2, and now you have 265 on the display. So this could display any amount of money up to $9.95. And as far as I know, the initial model was exactly the same, it just lacked the dollar keys, so it stopped at 95 cents. Of course, both those figures seem pretty limiting, but consider that $9.95 in 1879 was equivalent to something like $300, and even 95 cents would have been about $30, both of which are pretty big numbers for a single purchase at a saloon, which is of course where Riddy imagined this being used. These wouldn't have worked everywhere, but I don't think he was aiming for market dominance yet. On the other hand, the 5-cent increments seem even weirder, and I haven't found any explanation for those. I can tell you this was quite common in early registers, but nobody seems to feel the need to explain why, so all I can do is guess, but I have picked up a few clues. For one thing, while we think of the penny as utterly worthless today, apparently that perception is very old and had already appeared by the late 19th century. In fact, the Long Depression was just wrapping up in 1879, a fact I only just learned when I paused writing this script to watch Tasting History with Max Miller. In the late 1800s, the US Mint was already struggling to produce pennies without taking a loss, and people apparently hated carrying them around, so it may be the case that a lot of stores just priced everything in multiples of 5 cents to simplify matters. The trouble with that is that the general exchange rate from then to now is around 32 times, so nickel increments would effectively have forced prices to be $1.50, $3, $4.50, and so on, which are pretty big leaps. And for that matter, what about the pennies? There was a lot of stuff you could buy for a cent in those days, and indeed, once NCR began making these machines, they quickly introduced models with 1-cent increments, often referred to as candy shop machines, for what should be obvious reasons. The trouble is, those were only useful at candy shops because they couldn't specify amounts larger than about 25 cents. Most stores thus would have needed the 5-cent models, and the idea that those places just couldn't ring up intermediate prices seems preposterous to me. I feel like I must be missing something here because NCR continued selling 5-cent registers for decades. So All I can really think is that stores just rounded everything up or down to make it work, and for anything less than 5 cents, they just didn't care enough to put it through the register at all, but that feels shaky. So if anyone has more info on this, I'd love to hear it. Anyway, using this machine is incredibly simple. It doesn't actually do any calculations. Each press of a key represents a complete transaction. So each time you handle a sale, you add up the items in your head, then press the key labeled with the total, the hand on the dial swings around to the amount you pressed, and at the same time, a bell rings. Then for your next sale, you press another key, the hand swings around to the new value, the bell rings again, and that's it. That's all the machine does. At least on the outside. The inside is a different matter. Attached to the back of the dial is a hidden counter with a series of discs numbered from 0 to 9, and then one more numbered in 5-cent increments, so obviously this tracks dollars and cents. Each time you press a key on the register, as it displays the value on the dial, it also adds that value to the counter. So as each transaction is completed, the value accumulates up to $99,999.95, an amount we can safely assume no store ever handled at this point in time, but hey, it was future-proof. So at this point, it should be clear that there are two different mechanisms in play here, and this is actually acknowledged in the full name of the patent, which is properly called Improvements on Indicator and Register. As I understand it, the dial is the indicator, meaning it shows a current value, while the counter is the register, a term which, at the time, referred to an indelible log of events. So it's like this. During the working day, the dial shows the value of each transaction as it happens. So if you're getting rung up for a total of 65 cents, then you see 65 on the dial, that tells you how much to pay. But at the end of each business day, the store owner visits the register, opens the case with a key, reads the counter, and sees the total amount that was supposed to be taken in. He can then count the cash in the till, subtract the previous day's balance, and if there's a difference, then he knows someone's swiping.
Oh, man!
If they match, however, then all the money that was supposed to be there is, and he can then reset the counter to 0 to prepare for tomorrow. And that's all there is to it. That was Ritty's invention. And it seems pretty self-explanatory, right? You can see how it solves the problem, and it's so straightforward that you wonder why it wasn't invented, or at least adopted, sooner. And of course, we can say that about a lot of inventions, but an important detail is that, like many simple solutions to complex social problems, this doesn't actually work. I mean, not that it doesn't do what it says it does. What I mean is that it does nothing to solve the underlying problem. In fact, I think it's disingenuous that so many accounts of the early days of the industry simply assert that the introduction of these devices changed everything, when in reality, the machines themselves did nothing. The register, after all, isn't actually an authority figure. The products being sold aren't locked up until the transaction happens, so this doesn't force the cashier to behave because they can simply choose not to use it. I mean, you have to understand, when you walked into a bar in 1878 and asked for a drink, it wasn't unusual for the bartender to quote you a price, take your money, and then just pocket it. Like, this seems astonishing now, but I mean, the cash box was at one end of the bar, he might be at the other, so he'd just collect money as he went, and when he got back that way, he'd empty his pockets into the till. So if that's what you were used to, why would you notice or care that he hadn't done anything with the funky clock-looking gadget behind the bar? I mean, you obviously wouldn't. And that's a real problem because someone, after all, has to keep the cashier honest. There's a lot of misinformation floating around about exactly how this was achieved. It's broadly acknowledged that in order for registers to be effective, their use had to be enforced, but people seem widely mistaken about exactly how this was done. You'll recall I said that this register had a bell that sounded with each transaction, and yes, that's the origin of the phrase to ring up a sale, but there's a notion promulgated through many lazy retellings of this story that the purpose of that bell is to alert the store owner that a sale had occurred. I have a lot of beef with... No, it's just false, actually, and I know it, but let's explore the topic anyway. So you can sort of make it work in your head, right? If you imagine that the owner is always somewhere in the building, either a distant corner of the sales floor or maybe in a back room, where he might notice if a long period of time goes by without any bells sounding. That would prompt him to go snoop around the counter to see what's going on, but okay, for one thing, this assumes that he knows how often the bell should be ringing. If the fish just aren't biting today, how's he going to know that? And if there is brisk business, then is he really going to notice the difference between a ding every 10 minutes and one per 8? Of course not. So all a cashier has to do is fail to ring up every third transaction and nothing will seem amiss. But even that's unnecessary because the bell only says that a transaction occurred, not how much it was for. So nothing stops the clerk from asking the customer for 50 cents, pressing 25 to produce the ding, then pocketing the difference. And I could list a lot more threat models here, but you get the idea. It clearly isn't practical for the store owner to enforce use of the register, especially since he can only do that if, he's there. Remember that storekeepers sometimes have to leave the store. That's why we all know what it means to mind the shop, right? And if every time you left, all your clerks got a nice 1 hour free-for-all cash buffet, then the register wouldn't really be fixing anything. So the whole idea that the bell is for the owner's sake is nonsense, and we know this because Ritty's patent said as much. To wit, connected with the machine is a bell or other sounding device, which is operated whenever any of the keys are moved sufficiently to indicate their respective values, so that if the bell or other alarm is not sounded, the customer is aware that the amount paid has not been properly recorded by the clerk. In other words, Ritty didn't make a machine to police his cashiers, he made one that helps you do it. That's the whole reason the dial was so big after all, so you could see it from across the bar, so you knew how much the cashier had entered, and so you'd be able to tell if he was pulling any strings. If he asked for 25 cents but pressed 15, or took your money without punching anything into the register, then you knew he was pilfering, and you could either call him out on the spot or seek out the manager and narc. So, as Lupin III put it, everyone in the world's a cop now. And why not, right? After all, if a cashier is adding a 10-cent tip to every sale without telling you, then you're paying more for everything, which you obviously don't want. And even if they're charging the right amount and simply pocketing it, that hurts you too, because, let's be real, we're not talking about Walmart here. Our modern hypermassive corporate chains are so wealthy and so hell-bent on having footprint in as many places as possible that they can and will eat the cost from even enormous amounts of theft. But in 1879, if the clerks at your local saloon or shoe store were pocketing half the profits, at some point you just wouldn't have one of those anymore. So you had an interest in the store remaining solvent, and consumers in the 19th century knew all this, so it probably wasn't a huge lift to get them to play ball. The trouble was, they had to be told what exactly was expected of them. The register couldn't be useful unless everybody knew how it worked, and apparently that took some doing. One approach was, I guess, to just put up a sign explaining how the new system worked, and that was still happening even as late as the 1930s. Some machines had these enormous Far Cry-style tutorials printed on the back, which is very funny, but as anyone who's worked retail knows, customers don't read signs.
So do you have any new movies in?
For this new system to work, society had to be saturated with messaging about your new responsibilities as a customer, and who better than National Cash Register Company to solve that problem? They had the oomph not only to convince the public to expect these things everywhere, but also to convince store owners to buy them, and they did both. With gusto. A massive marketing campaign in trade magazines instructed shopkeepers that if they didn't have a register, they were bleeding money, while a simultaneous campaign in consumer publications instructed customers of every store to get a receipt. And on that point, we haven't addressed receipts yet, largely because Ritty's first machine didn't produce them, but that's kind of a historical curiosity because it's not really clear why it didn't. Receipts, after all, are an incredibly important part of this system, and also much older than you might realize. I mean, if we want to be pedantic, they go back forever. Some of the earliest examples of written language were receipts, recorded in literal cuneiform, but those were still made by human hands, so they were subject to falsification. Here, we're talking about automatic receipts, the sort we're used to nowadays. These are printed by a cash register at the same moment that the amount paid is recorded, so they represent an indisputable record of what was entered into the machine, and that idea also goes back forever, to the beginning of the cash register itself. This guy here, the cash recording machine, which I mentioned earlier, was the earliest known register to be patented back in 1876, and it did print receipts. Two of them, in fact. The first one was the receipt proper, the piece of paper that's handed to the customer, but the other was a roll of paper sealed inside the machine, which recorded the amount of every transaction in a continuous log known as a journal. And this was a huge upgrade over Riddy's approach. It doesn't give the sum of the day's take like his machine did, but the owner could easily obtain that by just adding up the values on the journal. In exchange for this slight inconvenience, he got a detailed record of each transaction, and meanwhile, the customer got their own record, which could be compared to it. This was useful for resolving disputes. If the customer claimed they were charged more money than was owed or were given the wrong change, then the receipt plus the journal plus the balance in the cash box could prove their case. Because again, the cashier was seen as a villain by both parties here, and the register as a tool to combat the clerk's unquenchable thirst for larceny. The receipts, plural, were the final nail in their coffin, as illustrated in this 1913 NCR ad. They sold this as a three-pronged system, where the customer's receipt proved what they'd been charged, the register's internal counters proved how much the store was owed, and the journal proved that the cashier had entered each sale correctly, giving all three parties proof of their good faith. Though, of course, this was a little disingenuous because, after all, the clerk wasn't actually allowed to have their receipt. It stayed locked up inside the machine where they couldn't tamper with it, but they could see it. Going back to this drawing, notice that you can see the journal tape because it's mounted inside a glass cabinet, and that's not just for demonstration. This was a critical design element that was actually mentioned in the patent. Now, they don't say why it's used, but I think it speaks for itself. The glass allows the journal to be seen by everyone involved in the transaction, and that serves the same purpose as a closed-circuit surveillance warning. The employee sees it, so they never forget that everything they do is being recorded, and the customer sees it, so they know that everything is being recorded. And by now, you can see how we got from point A to point B. Just like the cash recording machine, my Royal Register produces 2 receipts per transaction, one for the customer and a second sealed inside the machine where only the manager can get at it. Yet the cashier can still see it, so they never forget that anything they do goes on their permanent record. And this was actually still a feature on Royal Registers at least as late as 2015, 137 years later. Because things have never changed. The same frustrations still exist over a century later. Cashiers are still paid poorly and they still don't have much upward mobility. Skimming still looks very appealing and there are still ways to do it. The next time you go to a McDonald's drive-thru, for instance, take a look on the window and you'll probably see a sign that says, if you aren't offered a receipt, your meal is free. That's because people are still running the same old scam. You buy 3 McMuffins, then pull up to the window, hand the guy $10 in cash, and if he doesn't offer you a receipt, that might be because he just never rang those up and the $10 went in his pocket. Of course, we're talking about McDonald's here, so it's very possible your reaction is, hey, good for him. And I think the company knows that. That's probably why, instead of just offering a phone number to call to report your suspicions, they offer to comp your whole meal. They're probably aware that most people aren't paying much attention in the drive-thru, very few care about getting a receipt at all, and even fewer would feel so strongly about someone stealing from Mickey D's that they'd actually take the time to make a phone call, but probably a lot more people would do it for $10. A lot still wouldn't though, so McDonald's takes even more precautions. You'll recall that I had to log into my Royal Register, and the same happens at McDonald's. Every cashier has to sign in, and then every action they take is recorded alongside their name. So if the manager gets suspicious, they can compare each cashier's sales record to, say, the number of cars recorded in the drive-thru, and if there's a big difference, then they know who to start watching. And this too is nothing new. By the early 20th century, cash registers had become a lot more sophisticated. Rather than just pressing a single button to ring up a whole sale, they included features to add up totals, and sometimes even calculate change, and they also added buttons to identify which cashier was using a machine. Each receipt and journal entry included the clerk's ID, allowing management to track who was selling what and when, and they even built machines with multiple drawers, so if several cashiers were working one station, they didn't have access to each other's money. That way, if there was an imbalance, you knew exactly which employee was responsible. Now, I'm not sure how they prevented a cashier from just pressing someone else's button and doing scams in their name. There must have been some solution, but this is where my research runs aground because there's almost no info on this era of registers online. Fortunately, that's all the ancient history we need. There are many more interesting details about early registers, which again I might cover in a later video, but we've heard all the important parts. There are only about 5 core elements to a cash register, and they are as follows. The ability to enter a sales amount, either as a sum or a series of items, a visible indicator of the total, which the customer can see, automatically printed receipts, an internal log of transactions, and a secure counter that tracks cash flow. These all became universal very quickly after the industry's inception, except for the ability to calculate a total from separate items. I think that took a pretty long time to show up, but it had appeared by the early 20th century, which is pretty much where things solidified. These are still the only truly mandatory features, which is why I was able to take this register out of the box and just start using it. All I had to do was figure out where the basic features were, because they all work more or less the same way on every register, even after the metal linkages gave way to transistors. Though that was a pretty chaotic event. When electronics appeared in this market, it basically split into two evolutionary paths. One was for the new computerized point-of-sale systems, which added a lot of elaborations and features that were very useful for running stores, but weren't directly related to the handling of money. That was pretty much a solved problem, so they did that part very much like the machines they were replacing. But then there was a second track for the electronic cash register, which was more or less a direct evolution of its mechanical forebears. Rather than adding a bunch of peripheral features like the POS, these stuck pretty close to the simple task of tracking money, and insofar as some advanced features did trickle over from their sister industry, they only showed up in very minimal forms. For a case in point, let's finally go back to the Royal and I'll give you a tour. This is a very typical specimen of mid-90s register, and right off the bat, you'll guess that it isn't a PC. I mean, honestly, it's barely even a computer. There are no general purpose inputs, for instance, other than the numeric keypad. All the other keys are specialized actions for void, return, subtotal, that sort of thing. And while this 4x5 grid of department keys also serves as alphabetic inputs, they're only for defining department and clerk names, and also 4x5 is only 20 keys. So if you want any letters past T, you'll have to press Department Shift before each one, and I'll show you what that looks like later, because it's actually even more tedious than it sounds. Then on the output side, we have a couple 7-segment vacuum fluorescent displays with 2 rows each. One is for prices and quantities, and the other is for very rudimentary text. Also, I realize it's probably very hard to see those. These VFD displays seem to be going bad. I don't know what to do about that. There doesn't seem to be a brightness control anywhere, so hopefully you can read them. And of course, we have 2 separate screens, one facing the cashier while the other is on this little stalk, so you can face it towards the customer. And that's all there is for video output, if you want to call it that. Then finally, we have the receipt printer, or printers, who we already met, though I would like to take a moment to insult them. While the whole dual printer thing is pretty neat, the quality of the prints sucks. And while some of that is probably due to the new old stock ink ribbons I got, which are surely a little dried out, I suspect it wasn't much better when new, because I remember getting receipts like this and they always felt cheap and dismal. In fact, when I was growing up, I remember that the width of a receipt seemed to say a lot about where it came from. Nowadays, almost everyone uses the same 3.5-inch thermal paper, so no matter where you go, you get a nice, crisp, readable printout. 20 years ago, however, you only saw that from major chains. Most grocery stores and small chains used 2.5-inch thermal and sometimes dot matrix, and the readability was often a lot crummier, especially if they used 2-ply carbonless paper and handed you the yellow copy. Those were often barely legible. But the 1.5-inch stuff, like we have here, that was always dot matrix, and it always looked like crap. The paper quality itself always seemed to be really poor. The text was usually a very mimeograph-esque purple that often bled and smeared, and you pretty much only got these from really tiny businesses. By the time I had money to spend, they only showed up at smelly convenience stores and equally smelly thrift shops, so I always saw them as a marker of a place I didn't want to go back to. Anyway though, weird classism aside, that's it for the machine's hardware. There's no sockets on here. You can't plug in a barcode scanner or anything. There's no floppy drive or network interfaces. But again, this is only a shocker if you read this as a computer, which it really isn't by most standards. I'll prove this. When this machine arrived, it was pretty dirty. It had dust and fluff packed into every crevice, so I had to take it apart to clean it. And it turns out this is what the motherboard looks like. Half of that is a power supply, and then the other half just has a couple dumb logic ICs, plus this enormous custom chip that's probably an integrated printer and fluorescent display driver, and maybe a chunk of ROM that stores the firmware. Then on the flip side, we have the CPU, which isn't even a CPU as it turns out. It's actually an 8-bit microcontroller from Mitsubishi, and Okay, sure, that is a computer, but it's the kind you'd put in a thermostat. And as for storage, there's none to speak of, at least none that isn't volatile. While this thing does have a bunch of settings, it doesn't have an EEPROM, let alone flash memory to store them. The configuration and internal accounting are all kept in a single static RAM chip, storing all of 256 kilobits. That's kept alive when the machine is unplugged by a big old lithium battery that's clearly been hastily replaced at some point in this thing's life. But if you disconnect that, it just forgets everything it ever knew and goes back to factory defaults. There's actually a button in the printer compartment to do just that, which presumably interrupts power to the RAM chip. These are characteristics you'd expect to find in, a talking Darth Vader helmet. It's just about one of the simplest digital devices you could build in the mid-90s, and the reason it's so simple is because it does so little. It's really not much more than a dressed-up adding machine. Now, I've used that term once or twice in this video, and you might think it's just an archaic name for a calculator, but that's only sort of true. Originally, adding machines were a sort of mechanical desktop calculator commonly used for financial work. And when we switched over to electronic designs, the term largely went by the wayside, but that type of machine still exists, and some people still call them by the old name. This is one such device, and while it may look like a normal calculator at first, if you stare at it for a minute, you start to notice some odd things. For instance, the add and subtract keys have equal signs on them. There's a button here with 2 zeros. There's a grand total key over here. And then there's this slide switch here, which lets you pick a fixed decimal precision. Now, this can go up to floating point like any other modern calculator, and internally it always works at 12-digit precision, but if you're adding up money, you never want more than 2 digits to be displayed, especially on the integrated printer, because that makes it much harder to read. So if you slide this over to 2, it always rounds the output to 2 digits, and you can even pick which direction you want it to round, up or down. There's also a bunch of special features for stuff like doing arithmetic with time or multiplying by a standard tax rate, so there's a lot more to these things than you probably realized, but this video isn't about that. I just wanted to describe how you input numbers on them. See, while the keypad does have a decimal point, you're not really supposed to use it because that's really slow when you're adding up lots of numbers, say the amounts of all your credit card receipts for the day. So instead, the first 2 digits you enter are always treated as the cents component and the rest as dollars. If you want to enter $1.25, you punch in 125. For $10, you type 1000. And if you're entering a long series of whole dollar amounts, you can quickly enter 2 zeros with the 2 zeros button. So for $5, it's just 500, right? Right. Well, the same thing applies on this and every other register. So if I want to ring you up for $6.75, I just punch in 675, and it adds the decimal point implicitly. We even have the 00 button. So this thing is clearly optimized for entering dollar and cent values. And this is another really important difference that I see between a register and a POS. Point of sale systems, as you'll see when I eventually get to the video about them, are all-encompassing things. They don't just want to handle money, they want to understand what you're selling and have total control over it so that they can do centralized price updates, discount and coupon management, sales trend analysis, inventory tracking, and automated reordering. And all that stuff is useful, but for any of it to work, you have to give every single item you sell a unique stock keeping number, or SKU. In smaller systems, this is sometimes called a product lookup number, or PLU. But either way, you usually can't walk up to a POS machine and just punch in a dollar amount to charge to the customer because it wants to know exactly what you're selling, not just how much of it. Cash registers are not like this. The furthest the Royal goes into inventory management is that it will let you define some PLU numbers, but they're mostly just a shortcut for entering prices. Like, if you sell muffins, then you can make those PLU 5. And now cashiers can just punch in 5 instead of the full price, saving 1 or 2 keystrokes. And if you change the price of a muffin, then nobody has to be told. You just change the PLU and it'll use the new price the next time someone punches in 5. And there's also a little bit of reporting available on this. The machine can tell you how much 5 you sold today, but it's very basic, and hell, the PLUs don't even go up to 4 digits. So to all you grocery workers out there shivering in anticipation, sorry, no bananas today. Royal said no. What this machine does keep track of, however, are departments, and these are actually a feature in virtually every electronic register, as well as some of the higher-end mechanical ones. As I mentioned, we have 20 department keys on here, plus a shift button. So when you ring stuff up, you can put it into any of 40 categories, and that accomplishes a few different things. For one, the machine does generate some very basic reports, so you can see roughly how things are selling each day on a per department basis. And I suppose if your store had 40 items or less, you could just assign a department to each one and keep track that way. In fact, there's even a way to assign a price directly to a department key. So if I press L, that rings up a lighter in a single keystroke. It's very convenient. Mostly, however, you're going to use these for, departments. If you're a convenience store, that's things like general merch, beverages, cold food, hot food, alcohol, etc. And this actually explains why the feature is so universal, because several of those things are defined by their tax rates. In the US, for instance, non-prepared or cold food is untaxed. So you'd always need a category for that. And then things like alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline are all going to have their own rates. Then if you have a general sales tax in your state, you'll need to apply that as well. So the tax rates are assigned by departments. And that means you might need 4 or 5 departments to make this all work. Now, there's a little complexity to setting that up, and I'll show you what I mean later, but a lot of businesses wouldn't actually need to do it. If I was in Oregon, for instance, which has no sales tax, and I was running a store that didn't sell alcohol, gas, etc., then I could just take this out of the box, turn it on, and ring everything up in Department 1. And even if you do have to set it up, it's vastly quicker than configuring a point-of-sale system, and either way, once the departments are configured, they're once again just a place to store dollars and cents. If I want to ring up some sunglasses, I don't need to tell the register that's what I'm selling. I just put $3.50 in general merch, and that's that. And for most transactions, that's all you're going to do. You just enter the items the customer is buying one at a time, pick the right department for each, then hit subtotal. That gives you the final price with tax. You say that out loud, the customer chooses how they're going to pay, and that's that. Oh, it costs more than that. Oops. Well, now's a good time to discuss tenders. Not those. Tender is the industry term for taking your money, and a tender type is a form of money. This register supports 4 types: cash, check, and 2 types of credit. The default is cash though, so if you're giving me $5, I just enter 500, press total, it interprets it as cash, so your change appears on both screens, so I know how much to give you, and you know how much to expect. And for most transactions, that's all you'll need to do, but there are some common exceptions. One is split tenders. No, not those. A split tender is when you hand the clerk $5 in cash, then put the rest on a card. And I don't even need to show you how to do that. It works exactly how you'd expect, but an interesting detail is that it works even with redundant tenders. Not those. Suppose I ring you up for $10, okay? So here's the subtotal, it's $11. You hand me $5, so I put that in and hit total, and it registers it as cash, but the drawer doesn't open because the full total hasn't been paid yet. The screens now show the remaining balance, which is $6. So if you wanted to put that on a card, I could just run it for the remaining amount, press charge, and that zeroes out the total and opens the drawer. But suppose you changed your mind. After we put in the $5, you look in your wallet and realize you don't have your card, and the only other bill you have is a 20. So you hand me that, I enter 20, hit total, and the register gives change for what's left of the 20. Now, it makes perfect sense that this works, but it feels weird to me. Like, I kind of figured it'd expect me to clear the entry and put the cash all in at once, but no, it doesn't really care. However, there are some details about different tender types that I found very odd, at least at first. For instance, let's ring you up for $10 again, and now you hand me a credit card. If I now tell the register that I'm going to run $20 on the card, it gets mad. It won't accept that because it's over the total of the sale. In other words, this machine won't permit cash back on a card transaction. That's presumably because if we're using the industry definition of credit card, that is Visa, MasterCard, Amex, etc., while those can be tied to bank accounts, they're often literal credit lines, for which it's illicit to extract hard cash without paying a hefty advance fee. Now, the retailer can't tell the difference between credit and debit visas, so they just refuse to give cash back on any of them. It is permissible on debit cards, but I think you have to set that up as a separate tender type. It's not available out of the box. So all this makes sense, but what was weird to me is that it will issue change on checks. Now, I know all you Europeans out there are about to hit the macro on your keyboard that types out, haha, silly Americans still using checks, but in short, no. Personal checks have been virtually extinct here for decades. I've heard that old people still use them, mostly at grocery stores that choose to accept them as a value-added service, specifically because it sets them apart. But I haven't even seen a check in almost 20 years. We didn't accept them at either of my jobs. Anyone attempting to pass one was quietly assumed to be a fraudster, and this was largely status quo even by the 90s. But at the time this thing was made, there were still a lot of businesses choosing to accept them. So yeah, it takes checks. In fact, it has a very special feature just for that purpose. You see, when a cashier accepts a check, they're expected to record the transaction number on the back so it can be associated to a sale on the journal. But this is error prone, so the machine can do it for you instead. Now, I don't have any checks because I'm under the age of 80, so we'll just play make-believe. Let me get some paper here. A check. All right, so I ring up some items. I give you your subtotal. All right, that's going to be $11. So you write a check for that amount. I hit the tender button, it prints a receipt. I tear this off and hand it to you, and then I take your check and stick it in this big slot that you've been wondering about for the whole video. This slot guides the check in between the print head and the receipt paper so that it intercepts the ink that would normally land on the receipt. Now I press the check button twice, and it prints a single line identifying the date, the time, the transaction number, what tender type it was, and then the value of the transaction. And you can actually change this so that it prints the clerk ID and the register number if that's important to you. So it's pretty clever, but let's go back to this change thing. Suppose I ring up $10 of merch, and then I tell it $20 and put it on check. It actually calculates change, which I'm now expected to hand to you out of the drawer. And I had some trouble with this at first. I thought maybe I'd configured something wrong, but as I thought about it, I started to remember that people used to get cash back on checks, just like you can on debit cards. If you needed some cash to buy weed, you could just buy something at the store for $10, write a check for $30, and the store would give you the difference in legal tender. Truly, the past was a foreign country. In any case, though, that covers the whole process of taking money. You've seen everything that's needed for a typical transaction, so welcome to your new job at Quick Stop. Don't forget, you're here forever. Of course, you might get promoted to key holder someday. That's a cashier who has quasi-managerial responsibilities for little to no extra pay. So just in case that happens, we should cover a few advanced features. Thus far, everything I've pressed has been for putting money into the machine, but there are some buttons for taking it out, namely void and return. The first one you use during a transaction to correct a mistake or remove an unwanted item. So, all right, I add $5 of malt liquor. That's unleaded gas, but isn't that what I said? Then I enter another one by accident. Well, I can now hit void to just undo the last item, but critically, voids don't make the item disappear. They just add another line with a negative value. So the price is nullified, but the fact that the item was rung up and then removed is still recorded. And we won't get into it, but this is also to prevent a particular class of scam. Now, the return option works exactly the same way, except it's intended to reverse sales that happened in an earlier transaction. And this would commonly be used as part of a sale. Like, suppose you're returning $20 of merch, and then you're immediately going to buy another $10 of merch. I can put those both on the same ticket, and now when I hit total, I'll owe you $12. So the refund acts as a credit towards your purchase, and if you don't use it all, you get the rest in cash. Now, what's odd about this is that both features work exactly the same way, meaning I can void an item that was never rung up. Like, we have an empty ticket right now, okay? I haven't rung anything up, but if I enter $10 and void that, then hit total, I now owe you $11 on an otherwise empty sale, which seems like an oversight on Royal's part. I can't imagine why this would be permitted, but it does make a point because both of these sound like pretty high-level features. You might think that they're like looking back in the transaction history. No, they don't do anything. All they do is put a minus sign next to the next item you ring up and then store the amount in a separate internal counter, a point we'll come back to later. Next up, we have a few options for discounts. The first being the coupon key. If I ring you up for $20 and then I punch in 10 and hit coupon, it puts a minus 10 on the receipt and applies that amount to the whole transaction, as if you handed me a $10 bill to pay towards your total. The plus or minus buttons, however, apply markdowns or markups to individual items. So suppose you're buying lunch, right? It's $10 and you want to give me a $2 tip. So I put in the money, then I hit 20 plus percent, and it adds 20% or $2 to the last item. That way I can put your $2 in the drawer without it being off at the end of the day. And of course, we wouldn't even have this problem in the first place if I could just put the tip in my pocket, since it's, mine. But remember, cashiers can't be pocketing money. That's a no-no. So it goes in the drawer and I'll get it back later in my paycheck. Little hint, by the way. You might not get it back later. Look up the phrase wage theft sometime. Great read. Now, on the flip side, if there's a coupon or a sale going on for, say, 25% off snowshoes, then I can just put in your snowshoes. That's the biggest thing I've ever rung up on here. Then I type in 25% and hit minus, and it knocks that much off the price. And that's it for the discount feature. You just tell the machine how much to add or subtract, and it does it. And I think this is yet another illustration of how registers and point of sale systems differ. POS systems were designed for much larger businesses, massive chains and whatnot. And in that environment, it's a safe bet that you're handling too many transactions and too much stock for a manager to really have any idea how much money should be coming in versus going out, nor can they reasonably be expected to review the sales journal every day for anomalies. So Target just doesn't allow cashiers to mark things down by arbitrary amounts, because that would result in a lot of theft very quickly from people selling stuff to their friends at a 95% discount. POS systems have a lot of guardrails like this. Coupons and discounts all have to be pre-entered into the system by a manager, if not by corporate, along with a list of items they can apply to. And then they're typically applied either automatically when those items or combinations of items are added to a sale, or when the operator scans a barcode from an approved coupon. In some cases, cashiers can apply a discount up to a certain amount to any item, but after usually like 10 or 15% max, they need manager approval. There are sometimes hard limits on how many coupons can be used in a single transaction, and overuse can actually trigger investigations by loss prevention, albeit rarely. So, in the ancient tradition of the cash register, there's a lot of surveillance and paranoia going on. Here, however, there's none of that, because you're probably working directly under the store owner, who handles the inventory and accounting, and is probably going to notice if they're down a lot of stock and up a lot of money. And again, everything you do is recorded, so all they have to do is skim through the journal tape to find out if you've been issuing a lot of deep discounts. Then you get a stern talking to or a stern walk out the door. You might think a stern set of cuffs would follow as well, but the one time I was present for a coworker getting caught skimming, the boss just made him give the money back in exchange for not calling the cops, and then fired him. And I figured that's probably usually how it goes, because it's just a big pain in the ass to deal with the police and going to court and all that crap. Corporations have the time and staff, but Ma and Pa just want your ass gone. With that said, however, sometimes an employee does need to take money out of the till for good reasons, and to that end we have 3 final features. The first is no sale. If you press this, it just pops the drawer, and this is what you do if you, say, gave the wrong change or forgot to deposit a check, that sort of thing. Critically, however, you're never going to change what's in the drawer during a no sale unless you already screwed up putting in or removing money and are just correcting it. If you need to add or remove money outside of a sale, you need to use the PO and RA buttons, which stand for paid out and received on account. These are basically shortcuts that perform tenders, without ringing up any items. And all the use cases for these are things you'd never see happen at the front end in a corporate chain. For instance, small businesses sometimes have store accounts, or at least they used to. A store account is basically a little credit line offered to local businesses that seem reasonably trustworthy, so that employees can make purchases without needing to carry around a company credit card. And in the early 20th century, these were so common that there was a whole market for little tiny cabinets made just to hold credit slips. Your local grocery store might even let you open a tab. It was a weird time. Now, we actually had these at my first job, and our system was literally a metal box full of index cards that we'd write the name of a business on, along with a number of authorized individuals. If someone wanted to make a purchase on behalf of their boss, they'd just give us the company name, show ID, and we'd write the amount on the card. Then periodically the boss would come in and hand us a check to pay it off. That was quaint, but very anachronistic. By 2007, I think we might have been one of the last businesses still doing this, and I imagine if you work at a grocery or department store, you've never heard of it. When this machine was first sold, however, I imagine it was still kind of common, at least in like little local hardware stores and whatnot. So periodically, when an account has a balance owed, the business owner will come in to pay it, and if your boss isn't in, they're going to hand the cash or check to you. And even though that isn't a sale per se, the money still has to go in the drawer because that's the only safe place for it. So you hand me $300, that's 30, there we go, 300, and I press received on account. I stick the cash in the drawer, the register records that $300 was added, and I can hand you a receipt for this, but it's not a sales transaction. It's just a generic record that money came in. And the same goes in reverse. Say the roofers just finished re-roofing the place and they need to get paid. The boss isn't around and I don't have the authority to use the company checkbook. So I put in $300, I hit paid out, it pops the drawer, I start taking out an awful lot of money to hand to you. I pretty much clear out my entire drawer. I give you your receipt and there you go. Straightforward, right? Well, that's the thing. This is all very straightforward. If you haven't noticed, this machine only really has two verbs: add money to drawer and remove money from drawer. There's a dozen ways to do it, but they only differ in terms of which text appears on the receipt and which counters the money goes into. Remember how that very first machine from James Ritty had a counter that recorded how much money had passed through it? Well, those continued to be a thing even as receipts and journals became prevalent. If you think about the classic cash register you might see in a saloon in a Western, they always have that curved front panel. Well, that's actually a lid which you can unlock with a key to read the internal counters. And this is a thing you do either at the end of the day or in the middle to see how things are going so far. And those counters still exist today. Just, of course, these being electronic, there's a lot more of them and they're no longer physical. They're just stored in memory. So to see them, you have to ask the machine for a report. To do that, we need to go to reporting mode, but that means I have to explain the modes. The one control on the machine that I've been conspicuously avoiding so far is this key switch up here. This switches between various operational modes, and I have 3 different keys that determine which modes I can access. They're labeled Reg, Z, and Program, and they match up with the modes on the switch. So if I put in the Reg key, I can turn this to Reg 1, Reg 2, and X, but not to Z and not to Program. If I put in the Z key, it'll do everything up to Z, but it won't do Program. And if I put in Program, then it'll do everything. Now I'll explain what all these modes do, but in short, these privilege levels map pretty directly to common roles in a small store, namely owner, key holder, and cashier. There's actually a 4th level of sorts, but we'll get to that as we go through the modes. The first 2 are Reg 1 and Reg 2, which are for normal day-to-day sales. We've been in Reg 1 this whole time, but the sole difference between the two is that in Reg 2, the machine doesn't print receipts. And the manual doesn't explain why you'd use this mode, but I assume it's just because in the majority of tiny businesses, most customers don't want receipts, so it's just a waste of paper. But I think this is a good point to pause and revisit that topic, because now that you've had time to digest my earlier diatribe, there's probably some points you'd like to bring up, so I'll bring them up for you. I spent probably an hour of this video explaining the role that you play in this whole dance. I told you that as the customer, you have a sacred duty handed down by God himself, that is, National Cash Register Company, to watch the clerk's every move, make sure the total they give you matches what's on the register, to always get a receipt, and to report any signs of trickery to the management. Did you know you were supposed to be doing any of that? I feel like probably not, right? Chances are for any transaction less than like $50, you don't even expect a receipt because who's teaching that anymore? Maybe you have a distant memory of a parent admonishing you to always get a receipt, but most of us probably rolled our eyes at that. Like, yeah, Dad, I need a receipt for a $5 hamburger, sure. Or if you do always get a receipt, it's probably because you've actually gotten burned before, charged the wrong amount. Now, that has happened to me, and I was glad I got a receipt. But in that and pretty much every case I can think of, it was a good faith error. The employee just screwed up and pressed the wrong button. And that's not surprising because even if I did get the cashier with larceny in their heart, it's not like they could screw me over anyway because I was paying with a card. So yeah, about that. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering exactly how any of this skullduggery can work anymore when everyone just uses credit cards for everything, and for the most part, you're right. At least in the US, where cash is used for less than a fifth of our daily transactions. This is apparently less true in Europe, where more than 50% of sales are in cash, so I wonder if this is still a big problem over there, but either way, it's true that if you're using a card, the cashier pretty much can't screw you over. I mean, sure, there are techniques for stealing credit cards, like skimmers or just memorizing the numbers, but that's very different from what we've been talking about. It's tougher, there's higher stakes, it requires more prep and infrastructure, and it leaves a huge paper trail. So to actually profit from it, I imagine you'd have to really know what you're doing. So while card theft is rampant, I think almost all of it is from at least lightly organized criminals. And that's totally out of scope here. It's not a problem the register can solve, and it's not the kind of theft they were intended to solve. These only curb theft of cash. So as its use has declined over the last 40 years, embezzlement has become far less urgent a problem. This is weird because we spent the front half of the 20th century training everyone to fear the cashier, a tagline I'm shocked NCR never used, but by the time I was conscious, that seemed to have died out completely, which isn't really shocking. As register journals have become more detailed, closed-circuit surveillance has become more pervasive, and plastic has displaced cash, it's probably easier now to just take stock and fence it than to bother stealing money directly. To wit, I've made purchases at Best Buy on 3 separate occasions for high-dollar items that turned out to have been unsealed, replaced with worthless trash, then expertly resealed in either the stockroom or a central warehouse, and I'd love to put the ancient meme about this up on the screen, but unfortunately it uses an incredibly foul Spanish word, so if you know, you know. But the point is, I've been genuinely defrauded to the tune of, let's say, $5,000 by 3 different store employees. So at this point, I don't leave that store with any product unless I've opened the box and made sure it is what it says it is, yet I've never had a single doubt about the veracity of a cash register transaction. I think the first time I ever really thought about that was when I read Rick Crandall's book. In fact, as I grew up, got my first job, and started buying things, I always felt like the cashier's position was a kind of meaningless one. It felt like the register was the thing preventing me from taking what I wanted, and the clerk was just a functionary who knew which buttons to press to make it release my stuff. And to an extent, I was right. Point-of-sale systems have become pervasive even in smaller businesses, and all of them are obsessed with inventory tracking. So at this point, even relatively tiny stores don't want anything to leave without going through the system because it would throw off their numbers. So at this point, that's the visibly higher priority. With embezzlement seemingly a solved problem, the cash itself has taken a back seat. And most modern systems are tangibly more concerned with tracking what's being sold, getting your loyalty number, asking for a donation for the Bajoran War Orphans Fund, and selling you an extended warranty on your Bic lighter than with actually handling money and producing a record of same. And why not? Because really, that last part is perfunctory now. At this point, assuming you aren't counting the pennies on every purchase to stick within a strict budget, you probably wouldn't even notice if the cashier had their pole sign turned around so you couldn't see your total. And with the strong push for paperless everything over the last couple decades, most businesses now ask proactively if you even want a receipt. So the idea of a switch that disables them outright makes perfect sense now, but I suspect if this thing had been made in even the mid-80s, it would not have had this feature. It's one thing to have a button that disables the receipt for just one transaction. I'm pretty sure I've seen that on a few machines from the era, but to have a whole mode that can be switched on and left on suggests that by the time this was sold, the expectation of a receipt was already in decline. But it was certainly not yet dead. And I chose to pause and tell you all this info now because there's a subtle detail here to remind us that while things change, they also stay the same. Let me show you something about this mode switch. If I put the key in, then rotate it to say program, I can't take it back out. It's captive until I turn it off again. And this is meant to keep you from walking away and leaving the machine in a vulnerable state. But notice that both off and Reg 1 have elongated keyways. So I can put the key in, turn it on, and take it back out. And this creates some sort of a fourth privilege level. I said earlier that the different keys map to roles like store owner, key holder, cashier, etc., but those all assume you're trusted to hold some kind of key at all. If you've been there for at least a few months and you haven't done anything amiss, then the boss might give you your own reg key so you can at least turn the thing on in the morning. And if you know your customers rarely want receipts, then you can also put it in Reg 2 to save a little time and paper. But if you're the FNG who just hired on, you aren't getting your own key at all. Someone's going to turn the machine on for you in the morning, then pull their key out and just leave it in mode 1. That means you're stuck printing a receipt for every sale, increasing the likelihood that customers will take them and keeping you just that little bit more on your toes. Anyway, that was a real shaggy dog explanation, but the rest will go a bit quicker. The next two settings are called X and Z, and an awful lot of people who've worked retail have probably heard of these, but not known exactly what they did. Now, both modes generate daily reports. In other words, they spit out the values of all those internal counters I mentioned, and both options output the exact same data. But there's one important difference, which I'll tell you later. First, let's put it in X.
Put it in H!
Now, when we hit total, the machine spits out a very long receipt with a report on the day's sales. We'll just give this a bit. So first off, we have 270 items in general merch totaling $204, tax category 1, 14 beverages for $50, so on and so forth. Then we have the department total, that's all this summed up, the amount of tax charged, amount of coupons and discounts and add-ons, then the net, which is everything including the tax and coupons and discounts. Then the amounts of refunds and voids. Again, that's useful for identifying certain types of cashier fraud. Then we have the gross, which I don't really understand. That, I think, is the combination of all of this before the refunds and voids. I don't really know what the point of that is, but there it is. But then we have the tender breakdown, which shows how much money was taken in each tender type. And this is sort of the most important figure on the whole slip. Remember that the original purpose of the cash register was to tell you how much money should be in the till at the end of the day, and they still do that. Verifying the contents of the drawer, or balancing it, is still an essential part of the daily routine at every store. At close of business, every register has to be counted out by either a manager or a trusted cashier. So you open the drawer, count out all the cash, all the credit slips, all the checks, add each one up, and make sure that they match what's on the report. And this is why it's so important that the tenders are tracked separately, because if the register's out of whack because someone forgot to actually run a customer's credit card, a thing that happened more often than you'd think where I worked, you won't waste a bunch of time looking for missing cash because that part of the drawer will balance fine and only the credit slips will be off. The cash part is a little tough though, since the drawer doesn't begin the day empty. So before you count it, you need to know how much should be in there. And you could do this by taking the total amount for the day and subtracting what was in the drawer at the end of the previous day's close of business. Or you could just skip to the bottom of the report where it's been done for you. CID, or cash in drawer, is exactly what it sounds like. It tells you how much money should be in the drawer. When you first set the machine up, you tell it the amount that you're loading in, and forever afterwards it keeps a running tally so that at any moment you can ask it how much cash should be present. And I do mean any moment. You can ask for a CID check at any time of day, which is really useful if, for instance, you're a screw-up who keeps giving people the wrong change. Suppose a customer gives you $10 on a $5 sale. You give them $5 back and they say, "Hey, I handed you a 20, you owe me another 10. Now, this could be the swapperoo, the oldest trick in the book, so you can't take them at their word, which would make this a stalemate, except that you told the register they gave you a 10, a fact you both know because it's printed on the receipt. So if it was a 20, then the drawer will be over by $10, and thus all you have to do is count out the drawer and compare it to the CID to resolve this dispute. And this sounds like a huge pain, but trust me, I screwed this up regularly at my jobs, so I can tell you, once you get good at it, it really doesn't take that long, especially if you're only counting bills. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, $50. 150, 200, 200, 225, 230. No, sir, you're a liar. So the CID value is incredibly useful and important, but it does require that you track all the money going in and out perfectly. You can't take or leave a single penny without recording it, and this means that if your drawer is running low due to, say, performing a bunch of refunds and you need to replenish it from the store safe, you'll have to tell the register you're doing that so it knows a bunch of money is going to materialize out of nowhere. Amusingly, though, Royal had no solution for this. The manual says to just do it by entering the money as a received on account, which I think is incredibly funny. I guess they just got to this point, realized they hadn't solved for that problem, and said, "Oh, the hell with it. The manager will know what it means. We're not adding another button." In all seriousness, though, I do wonder if this is why the window over the journal can be opened. I'd never seen that on a cash register before. They're usually fixed in place so the journal is completely read-only unless you have the key. But here, not only can you flip this up and touch the receipt, but there seems to be a little platen underneath the bottom few lines. I think the idea was that you could use a pen to annotate the journal. So if you did do a receive on account or drawer adjustment, you could write a little note for later reference. If that was their intent, it's a pretty clever idea, but it is weird that they don't mention it anywhere in the manual if so. Anyway, the only values left on here are the totals for received account and paid out, and then a count of the number of no sale events. And then we have the grand total here at the bottom. That's basically everything on here added up together. So it's everything you made, less everything you refunded, voided, all your payouts, everything, to tell you how much you're up for the day. This says $77.70. So after all this crap happened, that's how much we made. We're going to go out of business soon. So that's it for the X report. How does the Z report differ? Well, it doesn't, except that as soon as it's done printing, it zeroes all the counters to prepare for the next day, just like you do on Ritty's dial machine back in 1879. That's why you need a special key to access the Z mode. Since it's outright destructive, being able to accidentally run a Z report would open up a lot of avenues for theft, so it's restricted to the higher privileges. This, by the way, is what's meant by closing a register. Once a Z-tape gets run at close of business, the register is considered closed until the next morning because once you've zeroed it out, any further transactions will get rolled into the next day's totals, making everything very confusing. Now, in addition to the X and Z reports, there are a couple others. It can spit out an hourly, which tells you how much is sold each hour of the current day, and you can get a clerk report, which tells you how much each clerk has taken in that day, and that's it. It's the absolute bare essentials and nothing more. There are no additional reports, no more detail to be had, and it certainly can't do anything like reprint the details of an earlier transaction, both because there isn't enough storage to remember them and because it just isn't for that. Like I said, the target audience for this kind of thing is stores so small that Well, if there's two people in an elevator and one of them farts, everyone knows who did it, right? It's hard to conceal theft at a 2 or 3 employee business, so this thing doesn't really need deep forensic capabilities, and if you're really concerned about it, just keep the journals. At my first job, we had banker's boxes stacked up in the office with 300 little paper spools in each one going back 10 years. At close of business, the boss would cut the tape, roll it up, write the date on it, and put it in the box, and if they suspected anything spooky was going on, they'd just go pull the journal and read it, one line at a time, with their eyes. And this all sounds really quaint. It's hard to picture something this pre-industrial still going on in the 2000s, but hey, the number of times we needed to consult those journals was like twice ever, because who'd be stupid enough to steal from a store the size of my living room? I mean, the answer is that one guy, but he did get caught and fired very quickly, so this was clearly good enough. So we're almost done at this point, but I did promise to show you how awkward the programming process is. But don't worry, we're not going to spend very long on that because there really isn't that much you can do. The manual for this thing, after all, is only 75 pages long, and about half of that is training, like examples of how to ring up different types of sale. Really, there's only about 40 pages of programming info, and most of it's pretty basic. For instance, the machine has some global options like whether tax rates get printed out, 12 versus 24-hour time, whether clerk numbers are even required, because yes, you can run this thing with no authentication at all, but the total number of those settings is 34. That should give an idea of the sophistication on display here. There's really not much to it. As I said earlier, the only setting you'll probably need to define are the tax rates, and that's only if you have a sales tax. But unfortunately, taxation is very complex, so the state tax table codes appendix makes my eyes bleed. I have no idea what they're trying to communicate here, and I don't want to, but fortunately, you can just set a fixed tax rate. The machine lets you define 4 tax rates that can be applied to different departments. If you need 5 or more, well, it's very unfortunate. You'll have to get a different machine. So we enter program mode. We pick our tax category, press tax 1, punch in the amount we want with 3 digits of decimal precision, and then press total, and there you go. That's set. This took me like 4 tries to get right because this machine uses 3 digits of precision. So to enter a tax rate of 9.451%, you enter 9451. Trouble is, the sales tax in Seattle is over 10% and has been for decades. So it's actually impossible now to use this machine in this city. This was extremely funny to me because while I'd already found out the machine wasn't Y2K compliant since it stores the year with only 2 digits, I wasn't prepared for it to not be 2010s compliant. Another setting that the average store owner might need to touch are the departments. By default, none of them have names and none of them apply tax. So you're probably gonna have to set up at least one. And this is by far the most Byzantine process in the whole machine. I mean, look at this. There's a lot of steps here because what you're doing is setting a whole series of flags at once. You start with, is it a normal product or fuel sold by the gallon? Can you ring up multiple items at once? Is there a limit on how much that item you can add in a single sale? Next page. Which tax category does it use? Is there a preset price? And does it have a name? It's hard to assemble this all on the fly in your head, I found. You kind of need to write it all down on a napkin to keep track, but the final input for a typical department is going to be something like 0001, subtotal. Enter 0 for no set price, pick a department, and then enter a description and press check/valid to save. Why is it mad at me? It doesn't sound that involved, but the first few times you do it, you're gonna have to repeat it over and over because you're pressing so many keys, you lose track of where you are in the process. And this is before you get to the department names, because entering those is kind of mind-numbing. Let me try this again. 00001, subtotal, 0, department. Okay, at least we got this far. So it wants a name, right? Well, I mentioned earlier that the department keys are also text entry keys, and sure enough, there's letters on these, but they're in alphabetical order going bottom to top, then left to right, which is so ass backwards from any other approach I've used that I hunt and peck on this thing like a 90-year-old. I mean, I don't expect QWERTY here, but could it at least be top to bottom? And that's before you deal with shift. Like I said earlier, after T, they restart the lettering down here with U, and my brain just cannot sort this out. So it took me 10 tries to enter the word lighter. Here, let's give it a shot. It's L-I-G. See, I'm doing all right now. T-E-R. Wait, that one was easy. What was I having trouble with? Beverage? It was beverage. Sir, no, don't do this. No. I have to do it all over. I pressed backspace too many times, and so I had to erase all of my work. 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. Subtotal 0, 9. B-E. Where's V? V, there it is. V-E-R-A-G-E. I did it. What's the button to save this? It's check valid. If I press this and it says error, I'm going full Office Space on this thing. Oh, I got it. Does it work? Does it work? Beverage! I won! You have to understand, I would have had a lot easier time with this the first go-around if I'd realized that the void key acts as backspace, but I hadn't. So every time I hit a wrong key, I had to hit clear and start from scratch. And I know that's on me, but I'm probably not the only person who got confused. I really think putting backspace on that key would have been nice, though now I discover that if you press backspace when there's nothing to backspace, you have to just throw away all your work anyway. I wrote in the script that this might not seem too tedious, but trust me, it is. I don't think you gotta take my word for this one. And I mean, it also just sucks as a computing device, right? The keypad buttons are stiff, they jam easily, the VFD is really hard to read. It's easy to forget your place going back and forth to the manual, and we haven't even gotten to numbers yet. Numbers are great. Suppose you want to make a department named Back to School with the number in the middle, okay? You can do that, but here's how it works. Program 00001, subtotal 0, department 18. Okay, so we put in B-A-C-K, my kingdom for a K. K. All right, now how do we enter a 2? Well, if we just press 2 on the keypad, nothing happens. Like it showed up here, but it's not there in the name because you have to erase that and enter 3, 2 on the numpad. And now a 2 appears up there. Why? Because numbers entered down here are interpreted as character codes from this violently non-ASCII code chart. 30 through 39 are the digits, and then 40 through 92 are various symbols and non-English characters, though there's a gap in the numbering between 40 and 67, which turns out to be the capital letters, which are actually what's entered when you use the department keys. So if you watch the bottom row of the screen, as I type, you can see those being entered here. It is a very weird way of doing things. Oh, also, if you want a space, you have to enter 2 zeros, but that's easy enough to remember. And there is one neat feature, which is wide characters. If you enter 01 before a character, nothing shows up here, but the next letter will be printed double wide. And let me set that up. C-R-D, O1C, O1R, O1D. If I now save this, and then we take a look at the receipt, you can see it's now normal width followed by the wide characters. So this is a pretty janky way of doing things, but you can see how it happened, and they did actually think ahead to the problems this process would cause. For instance, each receipt has the little banner at the top that says, "Your receipt, thank you." But you can replace that with any 5x18 chunk of text you like. Trouble is, that's likely to include a lot of digits, spaces, and symbols, especially if you want it center aligned, and no one's going to be able to keep track of all that in their head. So Royal included a little worksheet in the manual that you can pre-fill with all the character codes. You can work them all out ahead of time, then punch it all in one go, and have a decent chance of getting it right. So Yeah, I didn't cover every single feature in the whole thing, but that's most of it. Besides the department's tax rates and clerk IDs, there's really not much else in here. Just a few special features for regional requirements like VAT and the ability to limit coupon quantities and lock discounts to a fixed rate. So while the setup can be a little tedious, it's so limited in scope that at worst you couldn't burn more than an afternoon on it, and then you'll probably never need to touch it again. This machine really only has like 9 features, which is what made it a perfect choice to take you through the basics, and that's what we just did. Congratulations! You now know how to run a register. Any register, really. Like I said, they're all more or less the same, probably partly because the market wasn't really able to start thriving until NCR stopped patent trolling in the late 20th century, at which point I expect everyone picked up where they left off, but also because a lot of these ideas are just obvious. Again, this is a desktop calculator with dipping mustards on the side. If you gave an alien who'd never seen money the task of developing a cash register from first principles, they'd probably arrive at most of the same ideas. So the reason I spent what I assume will turn out to be an hour and a half explaining all this is because it is foundational. Even the maddeningly complex systems in use at Walmart and Home Depot work this way under the hood. So, for instance, if you ring something up by mistake on a Toshiba SurePOS or Oracle Micros system, and then you void it, it doesn't get deleted off the receipt. It's just followed by a second negative entry. So it'll be clear on the journal that you added and then voided an item. Likewise, managers still run Z reports at the end of the day, and they still check the total amount of voids or no sales to see if anyone's running games. Things change, things stay the same. The difference between this and everything else I'll show you in this series is all the stuff that comes after those basic functions. That's why I made this video. So when I show you a complex point of sale system, I don't have to explain why it demands that every item have an SKU, or if it doesn't do that, why that's an unusual feature. I also won't have to explain what a Z report is, just what that system puts on it. And I won't have to explain why the system is so paranoid, because you now fully understand that these things were born and grew out of a century and a half of paranoia across a whole industry. And hopefully that wasn't too unpleasant a lesson. So if you watched this entire incredibly long lecture, I just want to thank you so much for sticking around, because this video was a nightmare to produce. After weeks of false starts on the POS topic, then eventually giving up and pivoting to this, I had to read several books, scour Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and eBay for demo machines, get stood up for a week by a Facebook Marketplace seller, drive all over town looking for the right size receipt paper after the stuff I ordered got lost, pay $15 to an online vulture for an illegally reproduced scan of a terrible Xerox of the manual for this machine, and of course teach myself how to do every kind of transaction it can handle. And let's not forget, track down a 75-pound hunk of rusty metal, haul it back home, and clean it up solely to use as a prop for 3 minutes. So this ain't no Dan Olson video, but I worked my ass off on it while a lot of things were going wrong in my life, so I'm really grateful that you chose to watch it. And if you enjoyed it, well, great! I'm glad to hear that. And you're in luck. Probably, because I do intend to make more things in this series. So if that interests you, consider subscribing to my channel, and remember to turn on notifications if you want to find out when I upload more episodes. If you really liked it, however, please consider supporting me on Patreon like these folks are doing. This is my full-time job, and they not only pay for my rent and groceries, but also for the wildly varying artifacts I have to dredge up in order to cover these topics. So I couldn't possibly do this without their support. Thank you all so much. And everyone else, thanks for watching.